I was 17 when I first saw the black horse they called Storm, a nervous shadow pacing the far pen of my uncle's ranch, head high, manere a ragged river of night. Spring wind came down off the Montana foothills with the smell of thawed earth and sage, rattling the tin roof and the brittle cottonwood leaves that hadn't yet remembered how to be green. I hadn't remembered much either since the accident, only the slam of metal, the hush afterward, my mother's breath turning into a sound I had never heard from her before. My uncle said hard work would straighten me out, that time and sky and fence posts driven into honest ground could stitch a boy back together. I didn't argue, I didn't have words. But when Storm turned his head and pinned me with that bright, startled eye, something in me bristled in recognition, as if the anger that kept me upright had been waiting for a counterpart all along. They said he'd jumped 4 fences in a single night the week he arrived. They said he came from a foreclosure sale on the other side of the valley, half-starved, skin marked with white hair where old scars had set, a creature built for speed and stubbornness more than manners. They said don't go in there unless you want to learn to fly. And yet I found myself walking to the top rail after chores, every evening, hands stinking of leather and hay, heart drumming in a rhythm I tried to ignore. Storm would watch me the way lightning watches a horizon, ready to strike if it must, unwilling to move if it didn't have to. I talked to him in the low voice I used to talk to my father, telling him things I would never say to anyone else, the way grief can taste like metal, the way the world tilted without warning, the way I woke at 3 a.m. to the feeling that someone had said my name from another room where no one was. The first time I reached a hand through the rail, he did not flee or bite. He went still the way a forest goes still just before a wind. Then he flicked an ear and breathed against my fingers, hot and hay-sweet, and for a heartbeat I felt the ache in my chest ease. My uncle, Tom, watched from the barn door with a stance that meant he was already calculating risks. His bad news, kid, he said eventually. You want a horse to ride, you take Daisy. She's slow and sound, exactly like you need. I nodded and didn't argue. Then I went back to Storm's pen and stood there until the light went the color of pennies and the chill came up from the ground. On the 3rd evening, I brought an apple from the bunkhouse and cut it into quarters with my pocket knife, letting him smell the knife first, then the fruit. On the 5th, I climbed the rail and sat on the top board while he circled and snorted and finally stopped with his shoulder beneath my dangling boots, close enough that I could feel warmth lift off his hide. On the 7th, when everyone else was busy loading hay, I slipped into the pen and closed the gate behind me. The air went tight. Storm froze, head high, ribs expanding, one front hoof cocked as if he could launch himself backward into another century. Easy, I said, both palms open. Me too. I moved slow, a step, a breath, a step, until I could see the weave of his forelock and the pale whiskers along his muzzle and the tiny crescent of scar beneath his left eye. He trembled, but he let me set a hand against his neck, right where his pulse thudded. He was all rope and thunder under the skin, a wire humming with current. He turned his head the smallest degree and set his nose against my shoulder as if reading something printed there. When I came out of the pen 10 minutes later, Tom had a look on his face that I couldn't immediately name. Pride, maybe. Alarm, definitely. If you're going to do this, he said, you better do it right. Doing it right meant early mornings in the round pen, no bridle, no saddle, just a halter and a long line and a pocket full of patience I didn't know I had. It meant learning to make my voice low, my shoulders soft, my requests clear. It meant noticing how his ears tipped like little weather vanes, how his chest lifted when fear came and how quickly he offered fight when flight didn't suit him. It meant that sometimes he would run the rail until dust made halos in the light and the sweat made dark commas on his flanks, and other times he would simply stop, plant his feet, and regard me with the wry skepticism of a professor. We got used to each other. We learned that if I asked too fast he'd say no, and if he said no too hard I'd step back and ask slower. In the afternoons I mended fence with Tom, set posts, tamped earth, counted the winter-killed calves, listened to the radio buzz with market prices that never seemed high enough. There was a tightness in Tom's jaw he tried to hide. The winter had been hard, hay cost had doubled, and the Hollister spread to the south had been buying up exhausted ranches like a fire eats through sage. Man like Kane Hollister doesn't say no often, Tom muttered once, more to the wind than to me. When he says I'll take it, most folks hand him the deed just to get out of his shadow. I saw Hollister for the first time 2 weeks later, a silver truck sliding up the gravel road as if it had rights. Kane stepped out in a shirt that cost more than our month's feed bill, hat angled just so, smile like a blade. Tom, he said, as if they were old friends. Heard you picked up a wild one from the North Sale. Thought I'd come take a look. His gaze drifted past us and snagged on Storm, who tossed his head in what I swear was disgust. That one? Kane drawled. Pretty enough. Waste of time on a place like yours. He let it hang there. Tom didn't answer. The wind did, picking up grit and sending it skittering against the truck door. You know I've got cash, Kane added, almost kindly. And I've got buyers. Don't you want a little breathing room? Tom's jaw went tight. Not today, he said. Kane smiled again, slid his sunglasses back on, and tipped an imaginary hat at me like I'd been included in a joke. Maybe tomorrow, son. That evening a gate we always chained was found swung wide on the lower pasture, fresh tracks around it telling the story anyone could read. 2 heifers had wandered toward the ravine. We got them back before dark, but the chain was twisted beyond use and the padlock gone. Tom didn't curse, which scared me more than if he had. He just fetched another chain from the barn and wrapped it twice. I didn't sleep much. The next morning, when I brought Storm to the round pen, his skin rippled under my hand, nerves bright as wire again, as if he understood something about danger he couldn't explain. We worked anyway. Back, yield, step, look, the dance that teaches trust. At the end I slipped the line and stood with him in the center, breathing the same dust, feeling that strange, quiet thread between us hold. By June he wore a saddle. He didn't like it, but he tolerated it, and on a day that dawned so blue it almost hurt, Tom said, "Today." I nodded. Storm's muscles twitched under the blanket as I checked the cinch, my mouth so dry I could have sworn the whole of Montana had blown into it. I slid a foot into the stirrup, eased my weight into the leather, swung over, and Saturday. The world thinned to his back under me, to the coil of his spine, to the measured seethe of his breath. Easy, I said, and he was. We didn't do anything fancy. We walked. We turned. We stopped. We did it again until my thighs shook and his shoulders gleamed. When I slid down, I buried my face in his neck and smelled sun and sweat and horse, a smell that somehow rewired me so that the places grief had burned went cool. The first time he spooked with me up was a week later, when a pheasant shot from the ditch with a noise like shattering plates. He didn't bolt. He sprang, landed, gathered, and then chose to stay. I laughed like a lunatic, because the choice he made was not a thing I was used to receiving. Choice meant someone staying not out of duty or habit, but because the center held. I brought him carrots. I sang to him bad songs while I cleaned his hooves. I told him things I hadn't told anyone, like how sometimes I still dialed my dad's number by accident and listened to the voicemail just to prove the world still remembered his name. July came river hot and thunder heavy. The kind of heat that turns animals mean and men careless. The bank called Tom twice that week. Hollister's truck came by again, idled, left dust and a look I didn't like. In town the Flyers went up for the Pioneer Day endurance ride, a 30-mile loop through the foothills with a purse that would cover a hay truck and then some. Tom didn't say it, he didn't have to. 30 miles, he asked finally, measuring Storm with his eyes. He's got the lungs, I said. I don't know if he's got the manners. Tom's mouth tugged, the nearest thing to a smile I'd seen in days. Remind you of anybody? We trained at dawn, before the heat could turn the trail into a griddle. Storm learned to drink at the creek without stepping in, to take salt from my palm, to pick his way over shale and through choke cherry. He learned to tolerate other riders at a distance, though not much closer, and I learned how to keep my seat when he disagreed with my decisions in dramatic ways. The night before the race, lightning spidered over the far ridgeline and the wind turned metallic. Dry storm, Tom said from the porch, eyes on the horizon. Pray it stays off the grass. I didn't pray much anymore, but I did stand on the bunkhouse step and tell the Dak, in a voice halfway between command and plea, to be kind. The race morning broke with a sheen of heat already on it. Dozens of horses milled at the start, snorting, stamping, air sharp with sweat and expectation. Storm arched his neck and blew, ears pricked, presence so big that people edged away from us without meaning to. His beautiful, a girl on a chestnut mare whispered to nobody in particular. He knows, I said, and felt his shoulder bump my knee like a rude inside joke. The starter's pistol cracked. We moved. Storm didn't run. He flowed, settling into a ground-eating trot that felt like riding a long, rolling muscle. We passed a bay that had gone out too hot and a gray that hesitated at a creek crossing. We climbed switchbacks that turned my thighs to water. We came down a shale face where rock skittered under iron and I said things in his ear like poetry, nonsense and praise in equal measures. At 15 miles he was still full, ears flicking to my voice, mouth light on the bit. At 22, a riderless roan came tearing out of a draw, saddle skewed, eyes white. The roan passed us like a panicked river. "Rider down," somebody shouted behind, but confusion swirled and the trail in that stretch funneled to a goat path. I turned Storm off into the brush without thinking. He hesitated one breath and then shouldered into Chokecherry like he meant to make a door where none existed. We found the fallen rider 200 yards off the trail, half hidden in buffalo grass, helmet cracked, breathing butt out. There were no bars on my phone. "Go," the man croaked when I tried to give him water. "They'll find me." But he was wrong. The course was set to skirt this pocket. The roan had already taken the obvious path back. I looked at Storm. He looked back, calm in a way that made my own pulse quiet. "Find them," I said, and loosed the reins. It was absurd, trusting an animal with a task so human. But Storm lifted his head, triangulated on the faint sounds of riders down canyon, and picked a line through scrub so clever I would have sworn he'd been reading maps since birth. We broke back onto the trail in front of a string of competitors, my arm windmilling, voice gone raw shouting for help. 2 riders peeled off without question, one on the radio to a volunteer, one turning her horse with a crisp heel and disappearing toward the ravine. Storm stood under me blowing, eyes bright, as if we had only paused at an intersection to check directions. The volunteer marshal arrived fast. "You good to go?" he asked. I nodded, and we slid back into the stream of horses and miles, a little behind now, a lot more awake to the way luck and choices braid. We crossed the 25-mile vet check with good numbers, heart rate dropping under 60 in a minute, hydration fine. Tom was there with a coil of worry tucked into his mouth and a bucket of soaked beet pulp. "He looks strong," the vet said, handing me the card. "Keep him that way." I sponged Storm's neck and let him graze. He kept one ear on me like a compass point. "Hollister's boy is up front," Tom murmured as if reading the weather. "Watch your line on the ridge. He'll cut you if he can." We went back out into heat that had teeth, into sage that broke and mended under hoof, into sky so clean it stung. On the climb to the high ridge the wind shifted. It came down late and hot, carrying a smell that dropped straight into the pit of my stomach, smoke. I looked south. A smear of brown lifted against the blue. Far enough, I told myself, trying to keep my hands even. But when we topped out, the wind hit us honest and hard, and the smear wasn't a smear anymore. It was a rising, boiling thing, and the edge of it flickered in a way I had seen on television but never in real life. "Fire," someone said, voice flat with awe and an old fear older than all of us. The course marshals began rerouting riders at the next junction. The new path cut along the north shoulder of the ridge and dropped early. Hollister's boy, Colton, came knifing up behind us on a sorrel with chrome like a show pony, his mouth in a grin that didn't reach his eyes. "Move," he shouted, and tried to squeeze past on the outside where the trail was no wider than a prayer. Storm flattened his ears, and I put my heel against his side to hold the line. Colton bumped our stirrup anyway, and for a second I saw us sliding into air and rock. But Storm set his feet square and gave the sorrel a look I knew too well. "Do that again and see what happens." Colton cursed and fell in behind, too close, breathing down our tail. I hated him then, not because he was a rival but because recklessness has a smell when you've learned to respect edges the hard way. The wind gusted and the ridge grass hissed, and I felt Storm gather under me in the way he did when a decision had to be made. "Okay," I said, half to him and half to the ridge, and we moved. We didn't sprint. We slid the gears the way you do when you know how much is left to ask. We opened a gap and then another, not for glory but for space, because behind us the sky was beginning to look like the belly of a god that had chosen anger. By the time we dropped into the last canyon, the fire had become a thing with a voice, far off but speaking in a tongue that even animals understand. Ash began to fall like strange, slow snow. The creek at the canyon bottom ran low and warm. Storm drank because I asked him to, then lifted his head and stared upstream. I followed his gaze and saw it, a woman on a palomino frozen at a deadfall, horse quivering, rider white around the mouth. The main trail was blocked by 3 cottonwoods that had come down in a spring blow, and the marshal's ribbon we were supposed to follow had been burned off by some idiot's campfire earlier in the week, nobody fixing it because who expects a blaze in July that runs this far this fast? The canyon forked left and right and then lost itself in willow. The smoke made a canopy that turned everything a sepia that made depth hard to judge. "This way," I called, too loud, because fear makes you generous with air. The woman shook her head, unable to make her horse move. Colton's hoofbits pounded behind us. Storm shifted under me, picking his feet a little, not nervous, just awake. I let him have his head the smallest bit. "Find it," I said, the words I'd used earlier without thinking. He stepped left, then right, then lifted into a careful trot along an animal path I would have missed if my life had depended on it, because it may have. The little track skirted the deadfall, climbed a shelf of sandstone, and slid back down into the main bed beyond the tangle. I shouted directions to the woman until her palomino's ears locked on Storm and followed. Colton came last, swearing, but he came. We made the last climb with the fire at our backs and the finish arch like a trick of light in front of us. The crowd noise rose over the wind, and for the first time that day I let myself believe we might end how we'd begun, not with a prize, though a prize would be nice, but together, all 4 feet sound, lungs and heart still singing. We crossed third, which tasted like first, and the vet check gave Storm numbers that made Tom snort something like a laugh. "He's a machine," the vet said. "He's a miracle," I corrected, rubbing the star hidden in his forelock. They handed us a ribbon and a check that made Tom's shoulders drop a bare fraction, like a man who's been holding up a porch roof while someone wedges a beam under. We ate watermelon from paper plates while helicopters thudded south toward the line and ash drifted like lazy moths around the arena lights. The woman on the Palomino came to find us, eyes wet, voice rough. "Thank you, thank you, thank you." And I shook my head because there are moments thanks can't land on without breaking. Storm bumped my pocket for carrots and found them. The world, outrageously, went on turning. 2 days later, a different fire started closer in, whipped by wind through cheatgrass, turned a back pasture into a moving red geography before the volunteer department could get ahead of it. We ran water lines and slapped at sparks with wet sacks. In the scramble, a yearling bolted through a gap in a panel fence and tumbled down into a gully choked with old barbed wire and box elder. The smoke in that cut was so thick you could chew it. I slid down without thinking and hit nettles up to my thighs. The yearling was tangled tight, eyes rolling, the whites 2 little moons. "Easy, kid," I coughed, sawing at wire with fence pliers while my lungs tried to come out through my teeth. The fire edge, some 50 yards above, did a terrible, beautiful thing, lay down, then stand up again in a new place like a magician's trick. A gust hit and the smoke stepped closer. That's when I heard it. Storm screaming from the ridge in a sound I'd never heard from him, not fear exactly but fury at the shape of danger. When I looked up, he was already coming, shouldered off the hill like gravity was a suggestion, Tom swearing his name behind him. Storm slid into the gully and put his body between the yearling and the climb we'd need, as if he'd worked crews all his life. I cut the last loop of wire and the yearling lurched, stumbled, shoved his nose into Storm's shoulder like a panicked child. I grabbed a handful of Storm's manure and let him pull me up the worst part while I pushed the yearling from behind, coughing so hard I saw stars. We found a seam in the smoke and broke into air that didn't immediately burn. Tom was there with a rope and a prayer. The wind shifted, blessedly, finally, toward black, and the corner of pasture that had been about to go stopped wanting to. By nightfall the whole line was a waiting thing instead of a galloping one. Afterward, sitting on the bumper of the stock trailer with a wet towel over my head, I cried like the sky had finally found the crack inside me and poured through. Not because I'd been brave. Because I hadn't felt alone in the worst place. Storm stood tied to the rail nearby, head down, one hind leg cocked, eyes half closed, the picture of ordinary horse satisfaction, as if saving fools from gullies were a chore like any other. I went to him and pressed my forehead to the muscle of his neck, breathing him in like medicine. He turned his head and breathed back, and that exchange felt as sacred as any church I'd ever failed to be saved in. Hollister came one more time, checkbook in hand, a number on his tongue he thought no one would refuse. He stood by Storm's pen and looked at him like a thing, not a being, and I realized that was the different center our lives balanced around. "He's not for sale," Tom said before I could find my own voice. Kane Hollister laughed without humor. "Everything's for sale out here." Tom looked at me then, not at Storm, and something passed between us that wasn't words and never would be. "Not this," he said, and the wind chose that moment to push a clean ribbon of air across the yard, lifting dust and resolve together. Hollister folded his checkbook with a snap and left a promise hanging like a bad smell. He didn't keep it. Men like him usually do, but not always. Sometimes a thing you can't put a price on turns out to be heavier than the cash you were planning to carry it with. We kept the place. The race purse paid the feed bill. The insurance payout from the fence line fire replaced a pump we'd been nursing for a decade. My mother came out for Sunday dinner once the smoke cleared, bringing a pie that tasted like we had managed, all of us, to get through a winter we hadn't expected to survive. She stood by Storm with her cautious hands and let him smell her sleeve and said, quietly, "He's beautiful." Which meant I'm glad you are finding a way. Grief didn't vanish. It never does. It settled into a shape we could live around. When classes started up again in town, I drove in 3 days a week and spent the rest mending, writing, learning the vocabulary of pasture and rain and debt and how love sometimes looks like errands and sometimes looks like letting someone ride something you'd rather keep to yourself. Storm and I still worked at dawn, round pen shadows long and pale, his breath and mine stitching lines across the morning that felt like writing on a page the world had set down just for us. He learned to side pass to a fence so I could open a gate without dismounting. He learned to stand when I dropped the reins, to come when I whistled, to move his ribs under my calf like he understood the geometry my father once taught me when he showed me how to draw a circle without a compass. On the anniversary of the day we first met, I took him back to the high ridge at sunset. The grass had healed where the race trail had cut it. The blackened scar from the fire was stippled with green. We stood looking south, wind in our faces, nothing in my chest trying to get out. "You saved me," I said, because by then I'd stopped pretending I didn't talk to him. He flicked an ear as if to say don't be dramatic, but he leaned ever so slightly into my boot, the way you lean into a friend at a movie when the scene goes dark and you're not sure you want to be as brave as you're trying to be. Late that summer, the town held a small concert on the square to thank the volunteers and the ranchers that had helped hold the lines. A saxophonist played under strings of lights while kids ran with cups of lemonade and old men argued about rain that hadn't fallen yet. Yes, the same friend who'd found me in the cafe that night when everything broke open, drove up from Bozeman where he'd taken a photography job, said he wanted to shoot the way the light here lived on people's faces. He came out to the ranch the next morning, stood by the fence, lifted his camera, and caught Storm in that exact moment where the sun catches dust and turns it to gold. When he lowered the camera, he had that look people get when they've seen something true. "Frame that one," Tom said over my shoulder. "Put it where you'll see it on bad days." We did. We put it by the door, where you can't come or go without remembering. Some days are still hard. Some nights grief comes back with its old keys and lets itself in. Sometimes bills arrive like a weather front, and you spend an afternoon in the yard so you won't say things to the people you love that you'll wish you hadn't. But there's a horse who breathes warm on your sleeve and a man who learned to say no to an easy ruin and a mother who brings pie and a friend who shows you how the world looks when light chooses it. There's a ridge where fire once ran and now doesn't. There's a trail you found because you asked and he chose to listen. There's a finish arch in your memory that wasn't about the ribbon, not really, but about crossing a line with your heart still inside your ribs. On the first snow in November, big lazy flakes the size of quarters tumbling down through air that had remembered how to stay still, I turned Storm loose in the front pasture. He arched his neck and did that floating trot that looks like a thought someone made visible, then dropped to his knees and rolled, all 4 legs in the air, back and forth, the sheer animal joy of cold and clean making a laughter sound in my throat I hadn't heard since my father was alive. When he came up, white dust on black coat, he stood and looked at me like we two had invented winter and were debating whether to sell it. I put my hand to his face and felt breath and bone and honesty. "We're okay," I told him. He bumped my chest with his forehead as if he had been meaning to tell me the same thing. And for the first time in a long time, I believed it without having to argue myself into it.